So we've seen really kind of different versions of critical media psychology or critical psychology. And Matthew comes at it from a different perspective, right? And so, as I said, many of you have read his stuff from our class, so we're very happy that you're here.
Thanks for reading, first of all.
Thank you for coming, really, thank you.
And I write 1,500 words every morning.
I see that, you're very, yes.
Part of my thing that I do. And I think that maybe the single most important thing that I've done if I call this a career, I don't really call this a career, just it's my life. I wake up in the morning and say, what should I do today? And and this is what goes is starting the blog. The blog has been
Yes.
just, people ask me, why don't you send stuff in, submit stuff for journal publication? I said, why, what's the point? Why should I? This might sound a little arrogant, but I hope that you understand this when you hear this. I have original thoughts. Why do I need to have them diluted by other people's critiques? Let them write a reaction to my, so having a blog gives me complete control of what I want to say, how I say it, and on what topics I write on. It can be very diverse topics. So that blog has been a really powerful tool. And I'll give you one example just to encourage you all to do this if you don't already, which I guess I'm probably talking to the people who already do this. I stumbled across, one of my interests in a former life is psychoanalysis. And I have a hobby of reading as much of Freud's writings as I can. And in all of the readings I've done of Freud, I never encountered a mention of the iceberg model. Those of you in psychology know, and every introduction to psychology book calls this Freud's iceberg model. Yes. So I found now today we have a great free, complete writings of Freud online, and you can do a really thorough, control F search. And of course, I look through everything. There's no mention of an iceberg. Freud mentioned the iceberg to his biographer, Ernst Jones, in reference to Fechner's theory that an individual exists like an iceberg with 90% below the water. So there's no Freud's iceberg. He's never made this sketch. It's been erroneously, a scholar named Bowles, Richard Bowles, Robert Bowles, who's now dead, a historian of psychology, calls it textbookery. It's published once in a textbook. It's then republished and recited in 20, 30, 40, to half a century later, it becomes truth. It becomes textbookery. So I put up this little blog explaining a little more articulate, better thought out research, exactly what I just told you about this. That blog post, I can tell when introduction to psychology students hit Freud every semester. In a day, they must hit it like nationwide around the same, they must fall in the same chapter, in the Myers textbook or something, It spikes up. That one post has had something like 15,000 hits, 15,000 individual reads, and it also was reprinted this past year in the first online history of psychology textbook. I've gotten more mileage out of that, and it's not long. It could be. It's called The Myth of Freud's Iceberg. If you actually type in Freud's iceberg, it comes up like on the first page of the Google search. It's amazing. I'm amazed how this happened.
Pictures in it. Every textbook has it.
It's yes. Amazing. So The Myth of Freud's, that was the single most thing on a. So you wake up in the morning. One wakes up in the morning and says, "What am I thinking about today? What am I?" And kept grabbing onto that. And I think that has been important. And that's a link between, for those of you who want to use media within psychology. Does anyone have any questions about that aspect of things? Yeah. Or thoughts?
Well, I want to know, because you mentioned you read 1,500 words every morning. Yeah. How do you, and I would not part of this class, so I haven't read your blog. So it sounds like I want to, though.
Okay.
How did you create the body that you read consistently? Do you read the New York Times? I mean,
That's a really great question. I don't watch TV or listen to news or anything. I listen to the weather, and I listen to a lot of jazz. Honestly, I try to stay as disengaged with the world as I possibly can. But I can't. But the funny thing is, I'm not out of the loop because it's unavoidable, Like,
Right.
I'd have to work really hard to be deaf to it. So I know that there's an earthquake. I know that there's a coup going on, but I'm not like, I made a conscious decision. I think this is where, with Eric Fromm, who became a role model for my lifestyle, Zen Buddhism became very important. Not in a religious sense, but in a life philosophy sense, where I'm choosing not to engage with it because I don't know how long I'm here. And there's too much Thelonious Monk to listen to, you know. And so this is how it happens. To answer your question more accurately, I wake up in the morning, and I don't know if it comes from a dream, if it comes from something I've been reading, or where it comes from. I'm just like something I get interested in something, and then I'll pursue that interest. And what I do is for 4 hours, I have a split. I do 2 hours of research when I do a blog. 2 hours of research. I do an hour and a half of writing and a half hour of editing. And then that's my style. That's what worked for me. So if I get something that gets me burning, gets me interested. For example, one issue that came to my mind a few months ago was my education was in classical, as a classical musician. I went to conservatory for 6 years. Then I went to psychology, and then I went to interdisciplinary studies, media studies, or whatever it could be called in the program I've gone to. So I got to experience what is it like to go to art school. I don't mean visual art school, but I mean acoustical, oral art school. Where you have a one-on-one studio for the teacher, and 6 hours a day of practicing, and there's ensemble playing, and you're training out. What are you doing there, and what's the focus there, and then what do you call research in conservatory versus what do you call research in psychology? I say psychology, I mean academic psychology, versus what do you mean is in therapeutic psychology or psychoanalytic stuff, and then going into interdisciplinary studies or in the media communications department with Ned, that's where we met. What is that? That was a whole new experience of research. So when I have my psychology hat on, or when I was a little nervous coming today because I didn't know. I'm glad to see I'm amongst friends because I don't know how freely I'll be able to speak on this. But when I'm in the psychology, I teach in a psychology department. When I'm with those folks, strongly neuroscience based, there's one colleague who does psychoanalysis. There's another colleague who does holistic psychology. Those are the folks that I know I can kind of like speak openly with. The others I have to censor myself. I have to, be careful what I'm talking about. If I'm talking about research in art terms, there's no answers to those questions. They're broad. You just explore, and it's qualitative. You describe, you explore, you sink into it, you play it, you feel it, you listen to it. It's emic, and then you leave it knowing. Like Heidegger says, you walk into the woods. And at the end, your little walk, you don't know the answers to the questions, but you know the woods really well. You know the questions very well. That's what I think art is about and music's about, in my experience. That's completely different from quantitative research. I think it's quite similar to qualitative research.
And yet the roots of psychology, we have, I was talking about Max Wertheimer this morning.
Exactly.
And he was an accomplished pianist. And there's the whole new school, the one where...
You were like, this is like exactly in spirit where I'm thinking. Yeah.
Okay, because, and that there is this myth at the new school, which Joseph Greenbaum used to tell when Wertheimer was lecturing and spoke mostly German, very little English, and there was a piano on stage. And he would illustrate his concepts, he would lecture in German, and he would illustrate so people could get what he said by illustrating what was going on, and psychology's roots, I explore this whole history of aesthetics and psychology because a lot of our origins are there, study of perception, and intimately tied to early media, right, and the pi phenomenon, Gestalt.
And film, the emergence of film at the same time as Gestalt.
Yeah, exactly. So, so in a way, the trajectory, what you're talking about, is very much in keeping with our discipline's really, early history. And I think we need to bring that out again so that we can liberate ourselves to ask questions. And this whole idea of censoring ourselves, we understand that. And we were talking about that at the conference yesterday. And we were talking about that kind of early this morning about, people being surprised about, qualitative, is it
That's
acceptable?
true. That's true.
Is it not? But you also do something very interesting, which is you use sort of critical media theory, right? And
Yes.
critical, and you use that, like, Foucault and really as a kind of critique, which is using really media theory to then come in and sort of zero in on
Yeah.
our little discipline,
Yeah, that's true.
This
And
is
the
really
way
interesting.
media, so I wake up, that was of interest to me. How did I think in 3 different departments? So I wrote a blog on it that I think that went on like for a couple blogs. I talked about the movement from artistic thinking. It's like a whole different, I used the word Weltanschauung. It's a whole different Weltanschauung and shifting into the social sciences and going back to the Gestaltists, going back to William James, who I think, my goodness sake, everybody should be, in my opinion, everybody should be reading William James and to getting back to the roots of what happened before behaviorism hijacked. And the Gestaltists had no chance coming up against behaviorism, but James was an influence to the Gestalt theorists. The early Stumpf and whatnot were reading William James, and Nietzsche's another one. My goodness, to have psychology students read Nietzsche.
I think
Beyond
Nietzsche was
good and evil.
mentioned early this morning.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Made a declaration.
he made. I mean, James talks about what we're talking about today in neuroscience. He referred it to as nothing but psychology. In his Principle of Psychology, 1890 text, he talks about nothing but psychology. This is when you say, what is love? What is an emotion? It's nothing but oxytocin, or this neurotransmitter, this area of the brain. So James, and here's a name that Gestalt keeps coming back to. I think is really important for anyone doing anything to do with critical theory, and that's C.S. Peirce. Which I don't know, is Peirce being talked about today? Are folks doing Peirce?
Oh, well, yeah, yes, Don. We have a semiotic, Don Polkinghorne
Great,
teaches semiotics.
and that's great, because,
Yeah.
to act, in my way of getting Lyotard, Jean-Francois Lyotard, as well as Heidegger, was definitely kind of like mashing up Nietzsche and Peirce. That's when I mashed up Nietzsche in Peirce and ate mushrooms, then I got Heidegger.
And the mushrooms did.
And not morel mushrooms. Yeah.
Can I tweet that?
You can go and tweet it. Yeah, shamanism is another part of my explorations as well, which, that's interesting. But, yeah.
So, Ruth Ellen, at the guidelines panel session, was giving commentary, and she said that where do our students get their inspiration from in psychology? And she said we have to be free to look up literature and to get our inspiration from. And to which I then asked the question, I said, well, part of the problem with psychology is that we talk about social movements, we don't study Occupy, we don't do Occupy, we study, process, but we don't talk about content, right? And so you're a great example of having given yourself the kind of freedom to be inspired by, and I think you'll see all the people you saw here today, you're really using references from outside of psychology and freely bringing it in, right? So for generative thought and,
well, I think Lyotard was a big influence on this, and maybe this will be helpful for dissertation writing, because it was helpful for me in my dissertation writing. My advisor said he was a big Lyotardian. He said, I want you to drift. I want you to drift for an entire year. This is Victor Batanza. He said, I want you to drift for an entire year. Go out and read as much as you can. Don't don't limit yourself that has to only be on topic or whatever. He likened it to like a boat being moored to a pylon. And in this pylon, the boat, if you tether it, the boat can only go so far around this thing. He said, if you're doing this in your research, everybody's going to be writing around the same dissertation all the time. He said, cut that rope, allow yourself to drift for an entire. Now, I listened to all kind of music. I watched as many different films. I mean, I just let myself go freely for an entire year. And at the end of that year, I kind of sat back and said, what did I get here? And what I got was, so I think something I think it's what we're hitting on here, I called it the sadomasochistic dialectic. And this means, this was the doctoral dissertation was based on C.P. Snow's idea of the two cultures. And in the two cultures, he talks about this, what we're talking about, the quantitative and the qualitative humanities and the natural sciences butting heads. And I describe this as a sadomasochistic relationship. And remember that if you get the chance, if you haven't read or at least mentioned or read this, I forget who wrote that famous introduction to Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And in there, he writes in this thing how she infuriated her colleagues by not following the rules of academia. She took from art, she took from music, she took from everything, and just like, you listen to Eichmann in Jerusalem, it's like, wow, I mean, it's like a cultural experience, you know, it's all over the place. As for culturally speaking, I mean, she's making references between psychoanalysis and art and history and firsthand experience. Well, if you take these two cultures, that was my thing. I realized there was a sadomasochistic relationship between these, and Nietzsche and Arendt told us whenever you have this sadomasochistic relationship, and Foucault as well, you get into a master-slave narrative. But you know, in this is where Deleuze comes in. I don't like to throw out these names like a name drop, but you know this stuff. So I'm telling you, Deleuze took the hyphen out of the sadomasochism and combined one and pointed out, as Freud actually did right before, that in every sadist there's a masochist. And this is what made Arendt such a controversial person, and why they called her a self-loathing Jew and these other things, because she said what we have to realize is we play a role in this relationship. Why didn't this mass number of individuals who were being dominated, they outnumbered folks, why didn't they rise up? Why didn't they? There's like a mentality, I think it's a victim mentality that, now this isn't my area of specialty, but I drew connections between that and what's happening between quantitative and qualitative research in psychology, and that's the sadomasochistic dialectic. If there's not a number attached to it, a quantitative statistical number, if there's not an experiment, the experimentation in the terms is quantitative, then it somehow is not legitimate. It's not taken seriously, and it's almost like soft and hard, and that's the sadomasochistic relationship. Where I arrived at the end of it, my thinking was somehow qualitative folks like myself, we have to somehow not get caught up in that and just do it. Just do what we do, and don't ask for, don't apologize, don't ask for acceptance. Be careful, because you have to support your kids and stuff. That should be a factor involved in this, and maybe you don't. But just going in and doing it and putting that out there as much as possible. And after 11 years of disseminating, I've only ever taught undergraduate students, but I get them in their fourth year capstone history of psychology class, and I turn them on to this stuff, and they say, oh my goodness, this is the first time we're hearing about embodiment, and what humanism was really. I mean, do you know humanism's been purged out of the Myers Intro to Psych textbook? He doesn't list humanism as one of the major schools of thought in psychology anymore, or as a school of thought. It's mentioned in passing in his brief history of psychology. So the introduction to psychology students now, the final year, fourth year psychology students, I get to throw this out for them for 15 weeks. I'm hoping that I'm hoping after 11 years of doing this that, however many of them go on to be teachers are then going to, pass that on, and maybe that's how the revolution takes place. Occupy Introduction to Psychology classes.
It's so interesting when you mention Arendt pulling from all these sources, because there's actually one of the greatest little lines about psychology is in Arendt's, I think it's The Human Condition, where she has that little line where she says, so what did Pavlov really do? He created an unnatural dog. And I said, that's it. That's it. Wow. And you go, wow, that is amazing. But but drawing from all of these different sources is exactly what the early figures in psychology did, right? So, Fechner, and all of these people had they didn't have just a background in psychology, was yet to be invented, created as a discipline, right, as a professional discipline, but they drew from all over.
Remember, William James called it radical empiricism. He called himself an empiricist, but he called himself a radical empiricist. And that's more like Paul Feyerabend. In my reading, of course this is open for debate, but in my reading of Paul Feyerabend's an anarchist, he says anything goes in science. I say psychology because that's what I do. But I think that's what William James was onto. William James was, if you listen to his lectures on religion,
that's right.
This guy didn't say leave religion at the door. Didn't say this at all. I've heard that happen in classes, in undergraduate classes in psychology. Leave your religion at the door. Over at our campus in Newark, I have friends here in Manhattan studying at NYU and whatnot, the undergrads, and they said most of the students are atheists, and there's no issue with this. My students, I would be surprised if I had one atheist in a class of 80. Most of them are Coptic Christian, Muslim, Catholic, and probably I have had quite a few evangelical Christians in my class. It's a highly charged religious campus.
Muslims?
Many. Majority are either Muslim or Coptic Christian.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and so how do you leave religion at the door there? But these students do. But if you open this conversation, we actually have a course that I'm teaching for the first time next year there called The Psychology of Religion. But this isn't going to be, let's see how it's not the psychopathology of religion, because I think that's a popular route. Let's see what's wrong with people who need this. Mm-hmm. I said, no, from an existential point of view, let's understand why this is so important. Religion's a medium.
There's 2 points that meta points that you're making that I just think are interesting. One is there's a book called W.E.B. Du Bois and The Rise of Academic Apartheid. And it has to do with what Rayland Rabaka calls disciplinary decadence, the kind of turning inward and all that stuff left at the door. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of kind of a paranoid, schizoid position of disciplines at the moment, particularly psychology. But then I was thinking of the comment you made about the evangelical community, or for me, the Jewish community, kind of the most paranoid positions being the dominant voice and flattening out the dissenting voices that are raising questions about justice and love and how to enact one's faith for porous membranes rather than protected and paranoid membranes. And so when you talked about humanism being excavated out of the history of psychology, or James didn't have a shot with behaviorism, or you're in a room with neuro, they're not nervous about you, but you're nervous about that. It's a very interesting, I don't know that I would call it sadomasochism as much as I would talk about this disciplinary or religious or community posture that eats its own diversity. And I think we've seen that in the LGBT community, in the Jewish community, in the Black community, that eating one's, denying the complexity within, and it's the most kind of fascist element that rises as if it represents the group committed to silence. I don't know, there's something between the two of you.
It's interesting just to quickly mention that in the term sadomasochism in psychoanalytic literature, in therapeutic literature, there's, people typically think of as sexual sadomasochism, but I should clarify this. I'm talking about another thing called moral sadomasochism. And it's
Do you know Frieda Haag's essay?
I've heard about this, but I've never read this.
She's really cool. She's a German feminist, Marxist psychoanalyst. And she has an essay called Masochism that I used to teach my students, hated. but I love it. And it's about, she was in East Germany,
Okay.
and that when the state retreats from taking care of its people,
Yes.
women pick up the work. And she was, right, so we're all,
Wow,
and some men,
interesting.
good men are doing it too, but we're all like compensating
Right.
for the shrinking state because we don't want children and our parents hurt. And she argues that that's a form of like political masochism.
Interesting.
That if we all said, we're not doing it, like somebody has to pick up the work, but we won't allow that to happen to those around us.
Wow.
And
It's
that
kind of built in or something.
it's kind of built in. And so when corporate individualism and privatization takes over and evacuates the state, and we all pick up the pieces, and we're all doing it in universities now, right? Anyway, so students hated it because they felt like it was
I'll have to
victim
look
blaming,
into that.
and it is a little, but
Yeah.
thank you, I gotta
Thank you,
go.
Michelle.
What's her name?
Frisia Haug, Haug. She's great. She also has a book called Memory Work, and it's a Marxist feminist collective of women who did the biography of body parts and how they became sexualized, like armpits.
Wow.
Like, when I went to prison once wearing sleeveless, I was told you can't do that, because like armpits are, and it's all these women sitting around talking about, when did your knee, when did your thigh, when did your ass, so anyway.
You know, for me, I mean, I think that if there's commonality in all of this, and, Greg and your talk and Michelle and everything that we've seen here in the last couple of days, is kind of horizontality to knowledge and to asking questions. What happens when, and really, if you think of Bartlett's study, right, it's a seminal study, which really, it's not, a kind of sort of within a hierarchy, but it's really saying, here's this story, so what happens when it goes from here to here to here to here? And a lot of being a critical thinker is drawing from those sources that are parallel. They're not, so taking an idea from here and saying, well, what happens when we do this as a kind of normative, right? And we see this idea, and now it allows us to ask questions, or simply, what happens when we privatize? What gets left out? What changes? So in my mind, the way I conceptualize this is really a kind of horizontality, which is not what we get within our disciplines, because what we get within our disciplines is sort of within the paradigm, right? And it has a kind of boundary. But if we take a look, I'm very big on the history of psychology, because I think that, and I've said this to students that have taken this with me, that in my humble opinion, there's very little innovation that has happened, and some people would stop the history. I would be very generous and stop it in the 70s, but it gets and because a lot of the stuff that we're doing is we're acting like we're inventing something, we're being innovative when it's already been done, and so I think we need to get back to that creativity that would allow us to be really critical thinkers even within our universities. For example, I've always had this idea that I'm going to write, there's a textbook that I wanted to write about social media, but I was going to strictly use studies and ideas from the history of psychology. Because I don't think we currently have the psychology to be able to address what's happening there. And we really need to go back. I mean, there's stuff that was done that could really, and it's very odd, to approach it from that perspective, but we've lost certain ideas, when you think of, Cantrell and Allport writing on the psychology of radio, and he's grappling with the same issues, because he's saying psychology comes late to this. I mean, back then, he's saying this, you know, like it's already had a life cycle. He's saying, we come, and he's talking about, because the discipline is going in a certain direction and it doesn't allow me these questions, and yet when you read that book, it's perception is at the heart of that.